Okay, here's your video lecture for Chapter 3, Section 2. The structure of the atom. Okay, we've talked about the history of the atomic theory. Now we're going to move into what the atom is actually made of. In this particular section, we're going to look at two experiments in a little bit of depth to try to describe how these ideas were come by. So for this section, I'm going to want you to be able to define the following terms: atom, nucleus, electron, electron cloud, neutron, and proton. I'm going to want you to be able to summarize the observed properties of the cathode rays that led to the discovery of the electron. And we'll talk about that in a minute. I also want you to be able to summarize the experiment carried out by Rutherford and some of his coworkers that led to the discovery of the nucleus. And then I'm going to want you to be able to list the properties of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Let's start off with a couple of definitions. Atom, the smallest particle of an element that retains the chemical properties of that element. Okay, we established this definition earlier in the chapter. We're going to stick with that. Next up, the nucleus. It's a small, densely packed, positively charged central portion of the atom that contains nearly all of the mass, but nearly none of the volume. So it's almost like a point in space, and it is incredibly dense. Incredibly dense portion of the atom contains essentially all of the mass, but none of the volume. Neutron is a neutral particle that's in the nucleus. Okay, no charge, but it is in the nucleus. Proton, something that is also in the nucleus of an atom, but is positively charged. Electron cloud. This is a region. Okay, your book uses the term region around the nucleus. That is an area in which you may find electrons, and we'll talk about that idea of you may find electrons a little bit later on down the road. But for now, you need to know this is where the electrons will be found, and it is the negatively charged portion of the atom, and actually is most of the volume of the atom. And then the electron itself, the electron is a negatively charged particle in the atom. Okay, not in the nucleus. Not in the nucleus. Let's start with the discovery of the electron, just going in chronological order. In the late 1800s, electric current was passed through cathode ray tubes. It was discovered that the cathode ray was attracted to the positive pole of a magnet and repelled by the negative pole. This led to the discovery of electrons. In 1909, Robert Millikan measured the negative charge of the electron. He was able to quantify how much charge an electron had. From this, with that piece of information, that charge of the electron, he was also able to calculate the mass of an electron. For now, all you need to know that number is very, very, very small. The mass of the electron was about 1/2000th the mass of the simplest hydrogen atom. Okay, so a hydrogen atom, the smallest atom known, is about 2,000 times bigger than an electron. It's a very small piece of stuff. The negative charges of the electron equal the positive charges of an atom, which we now know as protons. So let's take a look at the actual experiment that was able to generate this information. So this is a picture of a cathode ray tube. And what a cathode ray tube is essentially a glass tube with a vacuum pump attached to it, and this pumps out gas. So inside the cathode ray tube is an extremely low pressure system with gases of different types. The type of experiment that Thomson was carrying out at this particular time was very common. Lots of scientists were doing this, not just Thomson. They were trying to investigate the nature of gases at low pressures. But when Thomson hooked up an electric current, they started to see this kind of glow. This glow you see from one end of the cathode ray tube to the other. And this kind of green laser-looking thing, it's not a laser, but laser-looking thing is that cathode ray. And cathode ray tubes aren't just some crazy thing that went the way of the dinosaur. I guess you could say now they are. Take that back. Cathode rays themselves are beams of electric current. They're emitted from a negative terminal called a cathode, and they travel towards a positive terminal called an anode. And yes, you will need to know that for a quick write on this section. Cathode ray tube technology led to TVs. Okay, the first TVs up until just a few years ago when they became outdated with the use of LED screens were cathode ray tube technology. If you were to break open the back of this kind of older TV right here, you would see a large glass tube, and that's how you would actually generate this kind of luminous area right here. So let's talk about Thomson's experiment specifically. He used magnets, okay? So he had this cathode ray tube system, low pressure inside of there. He used a vacuum pump to get all that gas. But then he added magnets to the equation. And let's remind ourselves what magnets are. Magnets have a positive side and a negative side. And remember, opposite charges attract. You guys have all played with magnets, so if you take the negative end of a magnet and you try to hold it near if you hold the positive end close to a negative end, they're going to attract. And vice versa. If you take the negative end and hold it towards the positive end, there's going to be an attraction. However, the converse is also true. If you try to hold a positive end of a magnet up to the positive end of a magnet, there's going to be a repulsion force. So let's remember that. So this idea, this cathode ray, Thomson wanted to see how a magnetic field would affect the cathode ray. And so he induced a magnetic field, and if the cathode ray had a negative charge, there would be a deflection. Okay, the cathode ray would bend towards the positive charge. Okay, and if the cathode ray had if it had a negative charge, if you induce that negative field next to the cathode rays, there would be deflection away. Alright, so with that in mind, let's see what we actually found out from this cathode ray set of experiments. These are the observations that were made. An object placed between the cathode and the anode end of the tube cast a shadow on the glass. So if there was an object inside the tube, a shadow would be cast, as though there was some light source on one end of the cathode ray. So there definitely was something moving through the cathode ray and was being blocked by that particular object. Second observation, the cathode rays were in fact deflected by the magnetic field in the same manner that a wire carrying some electric current, which was known to have a negative charge. And the rays were deflected away from the negatively charged object, So what Thomson saw was his cathode ray tube system, and he would shoot these, and they didn't know what they were. It's just some electric current. That's about all they knew about it. And they called it a cathode ray because it was in a cathode tube, right? So he just called this beam of stuff cathode rays, and he saw that they deflected towards the positive end of the magnetic field. Okay? They were deflected away from the negative and towards the positive. And so using our understanding of magnets, we can conclude that what the cathode ray was made of must have had a negative charge. And there's one more observation that was made. A paddle wheel that was placed on rails in between the electrodes rolled along, along the rails of the cathode, from the cathode to the anode. And so here's a picture of that system. Again, we have this glass tube. We have locations for the vacuum pump to remove the air. Here's the wires for the electric current. Okay, cathode, anode. The electric current would flow into the tube, and it would go from this area to this area. There would be a flow here. And this paddle wheel is set on these rails, and you can see if you look closely that the rails are actually elevated over here at the anode end. So for sure, if when you cranked this electric current on and the cathode ray flowed from cathode to anode like it does, and this paddle wheel started to move, it must be because something with mass is moving from this end of the cathode tube to the anode end of the cathode tube. And in fact, we did see that. Okay, that was observed. Once you kicked on those cathode rays, they would move from cathode to anode. Again, a very low pressure system on the inside here. And those cathode rays would impact the paddles on the paddle wheel, and they would cause the paddle wheel to move towards the anode end of the system. So from these observations, from this data, we were able to draw some conclusions. You were able to conclude that the cathode rays were made up of negatively charged particles. Okay, negatively charged particles. It did not matter what element was put into the cathode ray. Remember, they filled these cathode rays with a lot of different types of gases. They were investigating different gases, but it didn't matter what gas was in there at the time. They all moved in the same way, and so they all had negative particles that behaved the same way. These negative particles that all gases had here, or what we now call electrons. Now, Thomson didn't call them electrons; they were brand new. No one knew exactly what they were. So what Thomson did is he came up with this idea of what atoms are. Okay, remember he was dealing with gas, and so he was trying to describe how the atoms that make up that gas were constructed. And so he knew that from his cathode ray tube experiments that there were these things in the atom that were negatively charged. At that time, scientists did know that atoms in general were neutral. Okay, and were neutral. So if there was a negatively charged particle that they just discovered and attempted to describe, there must also be a positively charged particle there as well. Now, that had not been discovered. They had not observed those particular particles. And so their idea was, or Thomson's idea was, there are these small particles that are negatively charged, and you can see here in the diagram these blue, what we would now call electrons. But the best that Thomson could do was assume that the positive charge of an atom was just evenly distributed throughout the atom, kind of like some nebulous gaseous cloud, because there was no particle observed at that time that had a positive charge. Okay, and so this became known as Thomson's plum pudding model, and for a time this is how scientists believed that an atom was constructed. Well, let's move on to discovering that nucleus that we're missing here so far. In 1911, Ernst Rutherford, Hans Geiger, and Ernst Marsden bombarded a thin foil of gold with positively charged particles called alpha particles. Just a little background, Ernst Rutherford, he had actually recently won a Nobel Prize for his work with alpha particles. And so Ernst Rutherford knew a little bit about alpha particles. He knew that they were positively charged, and he knew that they had a mass of about 4 times a hydrogen atom. Okay, so those two things that he knew. And so what he decided to do was take those alpha particles and just throw them at some gold foil. We'll talk about that in a minute. Spoiler alert, they were surprised to find that a few of the particles, instead of moving essentially straight through the foil, bounced back towards the source. And because of that, they reasoned that there must be some small, positively charged portion of each gold atom. So let's look at it a little more closely. So what Rutherford designed was this, he put this screen up around the system to detect these alpha particles, and he used gold foil. And the reason they used gold foil, okay, is because his idea was, if I can get this layer of atoms 1 atom thin, I'm not going to have to worry about interactions with multiple atoms and how they were set up and try to interpret all that complex data. I'll be seeing these alpha particles interact with just 1 layer of atoms. A little bit simpler, a little bit easier to interpret the data there. At least that was the idea. And so Rutherford knew that the alpha particles were positively charged. Now, because the plum pudding model of the atom was such that there are negatively charged particles, and then in kind of a nebulous way, the positive charge is spread out throughout the rest of the atom. This is how Rutherford expected the alpha particles to travel through the atom. Now, you might think, okay, if you were to discover some sort of positive particle in here, these positively charged beams should deflect. Well, remember, this is a random distribution, so if this particle were to deflect an alpha particle, it would deflect down, but then because of this random distribution of other positive charges, it would rebound back and essentially, on average, take this original path, on average, generally speaking. So what he expected to see was that these alpha particles, which are fairly large things, again, they're 4 times the mass of a hydrogen atom, should just pass straight through. That's not what he observed. Okay, the expected results, like we just said, is going to move straight through this gold foil, but it did not. Okay, a small portion of the particles were deflected, and again, a small portion of the alpha particles. It was about 1 in every 8,000 alpha particles that were emitted at the gold foil were deflected. So it didn't happen often, but it did happen, and so that indicated there must be something small in the middle, that it would bounce straight back. He also was able to conclude that it had a positive charge because, again, Rutherford knew that alpha particles were positively charged, and remembering our magnets, positive charges repel other positive charges. So the fact that this was repelled by this whatever object was in the middle, it must be positive. Because only a small number of these alpha particles, such a small number, actually bounce back, most of the alpha particles traveled straight through with very little deflection. So here's a deflection, but is very small. He concluded that whatever was bouncing these things back must be very small because only a small number actually hit them. And here's actually a quote from Ernst Rutherford. "It was quite the most incredible event that has ever happened to me in my life. It was almost as incredible as if you fired a 15-inch shell, which is an artillery shell, at a piece of tissue paper, and it came back and hit you. On consideration, I realized that this scattering backward must be the result of a single collision. And when I made calculations, I saw that it was impossible to get anything of that order of magnitude unless you took a system in which the greater part of the mass of the atom was concentrated in a minute nucleus. It was then I had the idea of an atom with a minute, massive center carrying a charge. And that was the first idea of a nucleus, some nuclear concentration of matter came from this result, and Rutherford actually coined that term nucleus in his description of his results. So, in conclusion, Rutherford he said that it seemed that he was required to send an incredible number of missiles to get a hit. Okay, about 8,000 missiles for every one hit. He concluded that the grid of the atom must be composed of tiny, tiny cells, and only one cell contains all of the positive charge of an atom. Now, he doesn't mean like a biological cell, he just means like a region or a location. So the atom is made up mostly of empty space, because most of the mass of an atom is concentrated in that nucleus. So most of the atom is made up of empty space. Now, all of that mass must be concentrated in that positively charged nucleus in the center. And we do now know that it is protons and neutrons that make up that nucleus. So let's remind ourselves of some definitions here. Protons, we're talking about the composition of the nucleus. Protons are positively charged particles in the nucleus. Their positive charge offsets a negative charge of an electron. They have the same magnitude of charge, but opposite directions there. Through calculation, it was found that the mass of a proton is also a small number, but I'd like you to remember the mass of an electron and realize that this is about 4 orders of magnitude larger than an electron. So we see here that this mass, if you remember, the mass of an electron was about 2,000 times smaller than the simplest form of hydrogen. This is essentially all of the smallest form of hydrogen. Neutrons. Neutrons are neutral particles in a nucleus. Okay, I'd like to point out that the mass of a neutron is essentially identical to the mass of a proton. A neutron is, strictly speaking, the slightest bit more massive than a proton, but for our purposes in this class, we can kind of round that off and just say that the mass of a proton is about the same as the mass of a neutron. There is one little issue here that I'd like to point out. I don't know if you've picked up on it. If you remember that positive charges repel positive charges, and we have this nucleus that has a whole bunch of positively charged protons, and they're all packed together extremely densely, how can that be? Shouldn't they repel one another? And that should be the case, but we don't observe that happening. So again, how can the numerous positively charged protons exist packed into the nucleus without flying apart due to their like charges repelling one another? This problem, this idea, resulted in the postulation of this set of forces that we now know as nuclear forces. It was thought that at very, very incredibly short distances, that there is actually an attraction force of proton to proton, or protons to neutrons, or neutrons to neutrons, that hold that nucleus together. Okay, and to be honest, that's as deep as we're going to get into nuclear forces in this class. That at very incredibly short ranges, there actually is an attraction force that overcomes that normal repulsion force. And if for some reason the nucleus were to expand ever so slightly, that nuclear force would no longer be operating because the distance would not be short enough, and you would then experience a gigantic explosion of all those protons repelling one another. One last thing I want to leave you with, I want to put this in context, the size of atoms. An atomic radius, the radius of an entire atom, is anywhere between 40 and 270 picometers. And a picometer is about 10 to the negative 12th meter. So a picometer would be 0.000000000001 meters. The radius of the nucleus, however, not the atom, but just the nucleus, is about 1/1000th of a picometer. And this goes back to this idea that most of the atom is empty space, and the nucleus accounts for essentially none of the volume of an atom. To put this into context here, the size of the nucleus to the entire atom would be about the same as if you placed a dime at the center of a football field. The football field being the volume of an atom, the dime being the volume of the nucleus. So in truth, most of the atom is empty space. Okay, that concludes this video lecture. I hope you've been taking notes. I hope you watched this video, and we'll be working with this information in class. All right, I'll see you next period.